It had been 2 years since William's death, but the pain was still raw, still unbearable. Today was William's birthday, and Michael had come, as he always did, to leave a white rose on his son's grave. But as he approached, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, standing right in front of William's grave, was a young boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized, tattered jacket he wore. The boy's hands were stuffed into his pockets, and his head was bowed as if he were whispering something to the ground. Michael's heart skipped a beat. Who was this child, and what was he doing at William's grave? He took a step closer, his expensive shoes silent now on the soft grass. The boy didn't seem to notice him. He was too focused on the grave, his small shoulders hunched forward. "Hey!" Michael called out, his voice sharp but not unkind. The boy flinched, his head snapping up. His face was smudged with dirt and his eyes were wide with surprise and maybe a little fear. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the boy took a step back, as if he were about to run. "Wait," Michael said quickly, holding up a hand. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." He took another step closer, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, his gaze flickering between Michael and the grave. "John," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "John," Michael repeated, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "What are you doing here, John?" The boy looked down at the grave again, his small hands fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. I come here sometimes," he said quietly, "to talk to him." Michael's breath caught in his throat. "To talk to who?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "William," John said, his voice trembling. "He was my brother." Michael felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. William had a brother? How was that possible? He had never known about another child. He stared at John, his heart pounding in his chest. The boy looked so much like William, the same dark hair, the same sharp cheekbones. It was uncanny. Before Michael could say anything else, John turned and bolted, his small feet pounding against the grass as he ran toward the trees. "Wait!" Michael shouted, but it was too late. The boy was gone, disappearing into the shadows like a ghost. Michael stood there, frozen, his mind spinning. Who was this boy? How was he connected to William? And why had he never known about him? The questions swirled in his head, each one more urgent than the last. He looked down at William's grave, the white rose still clutched in his hand. For the first time in years, he felt something other than grief. He felt curiosity. He felt hope. He had to find John. Michael didn't sleep that night. The image of the boy, John, haunted him. Those wide, wary eyes, the way he had whispered, "He was my brother." It didn't make sense. Michael had been William's father, and he had never known about another child. Had William kept this a secret? Or was there something deeper, something Michael had missed in the years he had spent buried in his work? The next morning, Michael called his assistant, Sarah, into his office. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 30s, and she had been with him for years. She knew everything about his life, or so he thought. "Sarah," he said, his voice tense, "I need you to find someone for me. A boy. His name is John. He's about 10 years old, maybe younger. He was at William's grave yesterday." Sarah raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and left the room. Michael trusted her to get the job done. She always did. While he waited, Michael tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to the cemetery. He remembered the way John had looked at him, like he was afraid, but also like he wanted to say something. What was the boy hiding? And why had he run away? By the afternoon, Sarah returned with a file. "I found him," she said, placing the folder on Michael's desk. "His name is John Miller. He's 9 years old. He's been living on the streets for the past 2 years. No known family, no records of him in the system except for a few reports from social services." Michael's chest tightened as he flipped through the file. There were photos of John, dirty, thin, and alone. His heart ached for the boy. How had he ended up like this? And how was he connected to William? "There's more," Sarah said, her voice cautious. "I did some digging into William's past. It seems he had a close friend in elementary school, a girl named Emily Miller. She disappeared from his life around the time John was born. Michael's head snapped up. Emily Miller? Who is she? She was a single mother, Sarah explained. She passed away 2 years ago, around the same time as William. That's when John ended up on the streets. Michael's mind raced. Emily Miller, William's friend, John's mother. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture was still unclear. He needed to find John. He needed answers. That evening, Michael drove to the part of town where Sarah said John had been spotted. It was a rough area, filled with abandoned buildings and dimly lit streets. He parked his car and walked slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he had to try. After what felt like hours, he heard a faint sound, a soft rustling coming from an alley. He turned the corner and saw a small figure huddled under a pile of cardboard. It was John. The boy looked up, his eyes widening in fear when he saw Michael. He scrambled to his feet, ready to run, but Michael held up his hands. "Wait, John," he said gently. "Please. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk." John hesitated, his small body trembling. He looked so fragile, so alone. Michael's heart ached for him. "I know about your mother," Michael said softly. "Emily Miller. She was William's friend, wasn't she?" John's eyes filled with tears and he nodded. She told me about William," he whispered. "She said he was my brother." Michael took a step closer, his voice gentle. "Why didn't you tell me yesterday? Why did you run away?" John looked down, his small hands clenched into fists. "I was scared," he admitted. "I didn't know if you'd believe me, or if you'd even care." Michael's heart broke at the words. He knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. "I care, John," he said firmly. "I care about you, and I want to help you. Will you let me?" John looked at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Michael's face. Then slowly, he nodded. Michael reached out and gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you out of here." Michael's penthouse was nothing like the streets John had been living on. The floors were polished marble, the walls adorned with expensive art, and the windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. But as Michael led John inside, the boy didn't seem to notice any of it. He stood in the middle of the living room, his small frame dwarfed by the grandeur around him, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. This is where you live?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded, watching the boy carefully. "Yes, and for now it's your home too." John didn't respond. He just stood there, clutching the straps of the small backpack Michael had bought him on the way. It was filled with a few essentials, clothes, toiletries, and a toy car Michael had picked up at the store. The boy hadn't said much during the ride, but Michael could tell he was overwhelmed. "Come on," Michael said gently. "Let's get you cleaned up and fed." He led John to the guest bathroom and showed him how to use the shower. The boy hesitated, his hands trembling as he touched the shiny faucet. I don't know how to work this," he admitted, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Michael's heart ached. He knelt down and turned the water on, adjusting the temperature until it was just right. "It's okay," he said softly. "Take your time. There are clean towels here, and I'll leave some clothes outside the door for you." John nodded, still looking unsure, but Michael gave him an encouraging smile before leaving the room. As he waited, Michael's mind raced. He didn't know the first thing about taking care of a child, let alone one who had been through so much. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this boy was his responsibility, that somehow John was a part of William, a part of the family he had lost. When John finally emerged from the bathroom, he looked like a different child. His face was clean, his dark hair damp and neatly combed. He was wearing the new clothes Michael had left for him, a simple t-shirt and jeans, but they hung loosely on his thin frame. Michael made a mental note to take him shopping for better-fitting clothes soon. "Are you hungry?" Michael asked, leading John to the kitchen. The boy nodded shyly. Michael wasn't much of a cook, but he managed to make a simple meal of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. John ate quietly, his eyes darting around the room as if he were afraid someone might take the food away from him. "You don't have to be afraid here," Michael said gently. "You're safe now." John looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and doubt. "Why are you being so nice to me?" he asked. The question caught Michael off guard. He hesitated, searching for the right words. Because you're family," he said finally. "And family takes care of each other." John didn't respond, but Michael could see the tears welling up in the boy's eyes. He reached out and placed a hand on John's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. That night, after John had fallen asleep in the guest room, Michael sat in his study, staring at a photo of William. The boy's smile was so bright, so full of life. Michael's chest tightened as he thought about everything he had lost and everything he had just found. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. John was a mystery, a piece of the past that had come back to haunt him, or maybe to heal him. Either way, Michael knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this boy go. The next few days were a whirlwind for Michael. He took time off work, something he hadn't done in years, to focus on John. The boy was quiet and reserved, but Michael could see glimpses of curiosity and warmth beneath the surface. He just had to be patient. One morning, Michael found John sitting on the living room floor, staring at a photo album he had pulled from the shelf. It was filled with pictures of William, birthdays, holidays, soccer games. John's small fingers traced the edges of a photo of William laughing, his eyes bright with joy. "That was his 10th birthday," Michael said softly, sitting down beside him. "He loved that soccer ball. He carried it everywhere for weeks." John looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and longing. "He looks happy," he said quietly. "He was," Michael replied, his voice catching. "He was the happiest kid I knew." John hesitated, then pointed to another photo, a picture of William holding a trophy. "Was he good at soccer?" Michael smiled. "He was amazing. He worked so hard, always practicing after school. He wanted to be the best." John's eyes lit up for the first time since Michael had met him. "I like soccer too," he said shyly. "I used to play with some kids in the park, but I'm not very good." "You'll get better," Michael said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Maybe we can practice together sometime." John nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was the first time Michael had seen him smile, and it filled him with a strange sense of hope. Later that day, Michael decided it was time to ask the questions that had been burning in his mind. He sat John down in the living room, his tone gentle but serious. "John," he began, "I need to ask you something. You said William was your brother. Can you tell me more about that?" John's smile faded, and he looked down at his hands. "My mom, she told me about him," he said quietly. "She said William's dad was my dad too, but she never told him about me. She said it was complicated." Michael's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud was still a shock. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. "Did your mom ever tell you why she didn't tell me about you?" John shook his head. "She just said it was better that way. But after she died, I didn't have anyone. I tried to find William, but then I found out he was gone too." Michael's chest tightened. He couldn't imagine what John had been through, losing his mother, living on the streets, searching for a brother who was no longer there. It was too much for a child to bear. "I'm so sorry, John," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know about you. If I had, I would have been there for you. I promise I'll make it up to you now." John looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears. "Do you mean it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I mean it," Michael said firmly. "You're my family, John, and I'm not going to let you go." That night, as John slept, Michael sat in his study, staring at the photo album. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily, John's mother. She had been a part of William's life, a part of his own past, and he had never known. He felt a pang of guilt, wondering if he could have done something differently, if he could have been there for her and John. But there was no use dwelling on the past. What mattered now was the future. and the boy sleeping in the next room. John was a second chance, a chance to be the father he had failed to be for William, and Michael wasn't going to waste it. Over the next few weeks, Michael and John fell into a routine. Mornings were spent over breakfast, where Michael learned that John loved pancakes but hated oatmeal. Afternoons were filled with soccer practice in the park, where Michael taught John how to dribble and shoot. And evenings were quiet, with John curled up on the couch watching cartoons while Michael worked nearby. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. John still had moments of fear and uncertainty, especially when it came to trusting Michael. He would flinch at loud noises, hesitate before accepting gifts, and sometimes retreat into silence for hours. Michael knew it would take time for the boy to feel safe, and he was determined to be patient. One Saturday, Michael decided it was time to take a big step. He had been in touch with a lawyer to start the process of becoming John's legal guardian. It was a complicated process, but Michael was willing to do whatever it took to give John a stable home. That afternoon, he sat John down in the living room. "I need to talk to you about something important," he said, his tone gentle but serious. John looked up from the toy car he was playing with, his eyes wide with curiosity. "What is it?" "I've been talking to some people," Michael explained, "and I want to make sure you can stay here with me for good. That means I'll be your guardian, your family. But only if that's what you want." John's face scrunched up in thought. "What happens if I say no?" he asked quietly. Michael's heart ached at the question. "If you say no, we'll figure something else out. But I want you to know that I care about you, John. I want to be here for you, to take care of you. You don't have to be alone anymore." John didn't respond right away. He looked down at his hands, his small fingers fidgeting with the toy car. Finally, he looked up at Michael, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to be alone," he whispered. Michael reached out and gently placed a hand on John's shoulder. "You won't be," he said firmly. "I promise." That night, after John had gone to bed, Michael sat in his study, staring at the paperwork his lawyer had sent over. It was a lot to take in: legal forms, background checks, home visits, but none of that mattered. What mattered was John, and the chance to give him a better life. As he signed the first set of documents, Michael felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He thought about William, about all the moments they had missed because of his work, because of his inability to be present. He didn't want to make the same mistakes with John. This time he would do things differently. The next morning, Michael took John to the park for their usual soccer practice. But this time, he brought something special: a brand new soccer ball, just like the one William had loved. John's eyes lit up when he saw it. "Is that for me?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Michael nodded, smiling. "It's yours. But there's one condition." John tilted his head, curious. "What?" "You have to promise to practice with me every day," Michael said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Deal?" John grinned, his face lighting up with excitement. "Deal!" As they kicked the ball back and forth, Michael felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. John's laughter filled the air, and for a moment, it was as if William was there with them, his spirit alive in the joy of this new beginning. But Michael knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still questions about John's past, about Emily, about the life they had lived before. And there were still moments when the weight of his guilt threatened to overwhelm him. But for now he focused on the present, on the boy running across the field, his laughter echoing in the crisp morning air. John was his second chance, and Michael wasn't going to let him go. As the weeks turned into months, Michael and John settled into their new life together. John started school, and Michael made sure to be there for every parent-teacher meeting, every soccer game, and every bedtime story. But despite the progress they had made, there were still moments of tension. Times when John would shut down or lash out, and Michael would feel the weight of his inexperience as a parent. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Michael found John sitting on the floor of his room, his knees pulled up to his chest. The boy's face was streaked with tears, and his small hands were clenched into fists. "John?" Michael said softly, kneeling beside him. "What's wrong?" John didn't answer right away. He just stared at the floor, his breath coming in shaky gasps. Finally, he whispered, "I miss my mom." Michael's heart ached. He had been so focused on building a future for John that he hadn't fully considered the pain of the boy's past. He sat down beside John, placing a gentle hand on his back. "I know you miss her," Michael said quietly, "and it's okay to feel that way. You don't have to hide it from me." John looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears. "Why did she have to go? Why did everyone leave me?" The question hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He didn't have an answer, not one that would make sense to a child. Instead, he pulled John into a hug, holding him tightly as the boy cried. "I don't know why these things happen," Michael said, his voice trembling. "But I do know this. You're not alone anymore. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." That night, after John had fallen asleep, Michael sat in his study staring at a photo of William and Emily. He had found it in an old box of William's things, a picture of the two of them laughing together, their faces filled with joy. Michael had never known about Emily, about the role she had played in William's life. And now he couldn't help but wonder if he had failed her too. The next day, Michael decided it was time to face the past head-on. He reached out to Emily's old friends, her co-workers, anyone who might have known her. It wasn't easy. Emily had lived a quiet life, and many of the people he contacted had only vague memories of her. But slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to come together. He learned that Emily had been a kind, hard-working woman who had done her best to raise John on her own. She had struggled financially, often working multiple jobs to make ends meet. But despite the challenges, she had always put John first, giving him as much love and stability as she could. Michael also learned that Emily had kept her distance from him not out of spite, but out of fear. Fear that he would take John away, that he would use his wealth and influence to separate them. The realization filled Michael with guilt. He had been so focused on his career, so distant from William, that he had never given Emily a reason to trust him. That evening, Michael sat down with John and told him everything he had learned about Emily. He showed him the photo of her and William, and he talked about the kind of person she had been, strong, loving, and selfless. "Your mom loved you more than anything," Michael said, his voice filled with emotion. "And she did everything she could to give you a good life. I wish I had known her. I wish I could have been there for both of you." John listened quietly, his eyes wide with wonder. When Michael finished, the boy reached out and took the photo, holding it carefully in his small hands. "Can we keep this?" John asked softly. "Of course," Michael said, smiling through his tears. "She's a part of you, John, and she'll always be with us." As the days went on, Michael noticed a change in John. The boy seemed more at peace, more willing to open up about his feelings. And Michael, too, felt a sense of closure, a chance to make amends for the mistakes of his past. But there was still one more step he needed to take, one more way to honor Emily's memory and give John the life he deserved. The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Michael sat beside John, his hand resting reassuringly on the boy's shoulder. Across the room, the judge reviewed the final documents, her expression thoughtful. This was it. The moment Michael had been working toward for months, the moment he would officially become John's legal guardian. John fidgeted in his seat, his small hands clutching the edge of the table. He was wearing a new suit, one Michael had bought for the occasion, but he looked uncomfortable in the formal clothes. Michael leaned down and whispered, "It's going to be okay. Just a few more minutes." John nodded, but his eyes were wide with nervousness. Michael couldn't blame him. This was a big day for both of them. Finally, the judge looked up and smiled. "Mr. Carter," she began, "this is quite the unusual case. But after reviewing the evidence and speaking with social services, I'm satisfied that this arrangement is in John's best interest. Congratulations, you are now John's legal guardian." Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. He looked down at John, who was staring up at him with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Did she say yes?" John whispered. "She said yes," Michael replied, his voice filled with emotion. "You're officially part of the family." John's face broke into a wide grin, and for the first time in months he looked like a carefree child. Michael pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly as the weight of the moment settled over them. As they left the courtroom, John reached for Michael's hand, his small fingers curling around Michael's larger ones. "Does this mean I can call you Dad now?" he asked shyly. Michael's heart swelled. He knelt down so he was eye level with John, his voice soft but firm. "If that's what you want, then yes. I'd be honored to be your dad." John nodded, his eyes shining with happiness. "Okay, Dad." The word sent a rush of emotion through Michael. He had spent so many years chasing success, building a career and accumulating wealth, but in that moment he realized that none of it compared to this, the simple, profound joy of being called Dad. That evening they celebrated with a small dinner at home. Michael had ordered John's favorite food, pizza, and they ate it on the living room floor, laughing and talking like they had been a family for years. Afterward, Michael brought out a photo album he had been working on in secret. It was filled with pictures of John, his first day of school, their soccer practices, their trips to the park. But it also included photos of William and Emily, a way to honor the past while embracing the future. John flipped through the album, his eyes wide with wonder. "Is this for me?" he asked. "It's for us," Michael replied. "So we never forget where we came from and how far we've come." As the night wore on, Michael sat on the couch watching John play with his toy cars on the floor. The boys' laughter filled the room, and for the first time in years, Michael felt a sense of peace. He had lost so much, William, Emily, the years he could have spent with John, but he had also gained something priceless, a second chance, a family. John looked up at him, his face glowing with happiness. "Dad?" he said. "Yes, John?" "Thank you," the boy said simply, "for everything." Michael's eyes filled with tears. He reached out and pulled John into a hug, holding him tightly. "No, John," he said softly. "Thank you for giving me a reason to keep going." As they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, Michael knew that this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, times when John would struggle, times when Michael would doubt himself. But they would face them together as a family. And in that moment, Michael realized that love wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up day after day and choosing to be there for each other. It was about forgiveness, second chances, and the unbreakable bonds that tied them together. John was his son and Michael was his dad, and that was all that mattered.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.